Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism midweek special. I hope you and yours are well. Nice to have you back. And as you know, in this the midweek show, we like to talk about things out with Scotland, but things that we should be paying attention to, because one day, hopefully soon, we'll be in the big world and we'll need to take a position on these things. And there's nothing more pressing at the moment than the conflicts in both Ukraine and Palestine. And I want to cover on the case in Palestine in today's episode. So let me bring in my guest, of course, my resident guest, Lloyd Quinnan, who you all know. Lloyd, my friend, how are you?
I'm well, Roddy. Difficult times we live in.
Yeah, indeed it is. And also joining me today, I'm delighted to welcome back Anis Al-Tikriti, who is the founder of the Cordoba Foundation, which tries to show that the conflicts around the world are aimed and try and bring cohesion towards the West and to the West Asia, etc. nations. Have I described that well enough, Anis?
It's a pleasure being here, Roddy. Thank you so much for that intro, and it's a pleasure being with you, Lloyd.
Great to have you back. We have, as you, ladies and gentlemen, noticed, we've called this show in memory of Aaron Bushnell. Now, some of you might not know who Aaron Bushnell is, but this week, Aaron Bushnell, a serving United States airman, went to the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., poured flammable liquid, for instance, petrol, upon himself and burnt himself to death while shouting "Free Palestine." Anis, it's a terrible thing, any life being taken, and one to do that, any kind of suicidal action is a terrible thing. But will his action, do you think, have any lasting effect?
Well, first and foremost, Roddy, I congratulate you on choosing the theme for today's show. And I think that it's an absolute must that Aaron Bushnell, as well as the countless brave individuals who were in positions of privilege, to be perfectly honest, in any other consideration that you might shed light on, yet they felt the pain and the suffering of people thousands of miles away from where they lived and where they worked. And they saw that as means to basically condemn the very institutions that they were serving. And Aaron Bushnell, what he did 2 days ago, was a call to humanity, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's something that is, whilst something that is extremely personal and extremely tragic, but at the same time it encompasses all in terms of the message of condemnation of Western institutions, of the institution that he, and by the way, I mean him, when he set light to himself, he was in full military garb, he was in full military fatigue, and that to me was a message in the fact that his very last words were "Free Palestine." I think that Aaron Bushnell, I mean, when the time comes and when people realize what's a lie, what a series of lies we are living, I hope that someone will find it within themselves to erect a statue in his name and to have a plaque, and that our kids and grandkids will read about someone as brave, as principled, as courageous, as selfless, despite the very, sort of, if you wish, selfish act that he did, but entirely selfless act that he sent, and the fact that the world media has chosen to totally ignore this tremendous event, this absolutely incredible advent, is, I believe, a sign that Aaron Bushnell will be remembered in the right places in people's minds and hearts forever.
I certainly hope so, Lloyd. I wrote an article on Tuesday about Aaron Bushnell because I remembered, it reminded me I'm old enough to remember when Jan Polak set fire to himself in Gdansk over the Soviet Union invasion of Czechoslovakia to end the Czech Spring. And the Western media were onto it because it was bad Soviet Union, bad communism, good democracy. This is what happens, and etc. They used it. But on this one today, when I checked the front page of the BBC, no mention of Aaron. And the CNN, no, they were talking about the Michigan primaries. The Western media are trying to hide it, and in so doing, they're trying to hide their complicity in the genocide that's happening in Palestine.
I think, like much of the information about what's been happening during the current phase of the conflict, this shows to us the extent of censorship that we are subject to. The first thing that came into my mind when I saw the pictures of Aaron Bushnell, where it took me back to 1968 and seeing those extraordinary pictures of the young Czech student Jan Palak burning himself to death because of the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact countries. And it's an expression of utter and complete frustration, and to some degree an expression of a feeling of hopelessness and personal helplessness. But as Anna said, what that young man did was extremely courageous. I mean, it's beyond understanding, really. As a father, I can't imagine how his family feel, but obviously he felt a depth of guilt at wearing the uniform of the country which claims to be the home of the brave and the land of the free, but has been exercising its power on behalf of a rogue and genocidal state. And obviously this became too much for that young man, and it's an extraordinary thing to do, and it's a very hard thing to watch. But I worry deeply about particularly the British Broadcasting Corporation and its ability to find means by which they do not inform the people of this event. I mean, I know from people who have made complaints to the BBC about this, that what they're saying is they can't show those pictures. They can tell the story, but they're choosing not to. And that's the real tragedy.
Yep. I've often said, Annis, that the biggest crime of the media in the West is not that they lie to us. They do, but that's not the biggest sin. The biggest sin is what they don't tell us, what they hide from us, as Lloyd is alluding to. Because I worried in my article I wrote that I was worried that they would do one or two things: either ignore it, which they seem to be doing, or start casting aspersions on this young man's character, his mental health, or whatever. But it is shocking that they're not reporting the news.
It's I agree absolutely, and the thing is, I think that it's now been a while, probably a few decades, that the media have absolutely lost sight of exactly why it is that they are there. I mean, besides entertainment, which is there aplenty, the media serves an incredibly important role in our lives, in our futures. On one level, the media is a pillar of our democracy. The age-old question regarding democracy that was asked even during times of Aristotle and Plato, of how it is that you can equate the voice and the vote of a peasant who might not be able to read or write, who doesn't know anything beyond his field, that he sows seeds and rears cattle and the such, and the vote of a seasoned politician, someone who's aware, who's educated, who travels the world. How do you equate the two? The theory is that both get their information from the same pool. And that pool essentially is the pool of the media. So imagine if that pool was absolutely polluted, was absolutely corrupt, was bought. Imagine what kind of state of democracy we have in that case. And unfortunately, the media have, as well as lied and misinformed, as you just mentioned, but they have wagged the dogs. They are the tail that is beginning and has been wagging the dog. They are directing policies. They are creating perceptions. They are creating narratives. They are coming up with policy suggestions, with fears upon which politicians then move to create laws and the such. And the second element, which I feel that the media has totally abdicated in terms of their responsibility, is that the media basically constitutes the archives of our history. For the next generations, our children, our grandchildren, when they read back about the events that happen and make their own minds about how the world is being shaped. And it breaks my heart that so many events, so many advents, simply because of political or ideological tendencies, get wiped off the pages of history. And therefore our children won't have the chance to reflect, to see what's happened in the past, to try to avert the same problems from ever occurring again. I believe that the media, unfortunately, is not just being lazy, is not just innocently being sort of a little bit slack in terms of their professionalism. I feel that we have a mainstream media today that is decidedly part of the crisis that engulfs us from every angle possible.
I agree. I think the media are part of the problem. They're certainly not the solution to the problem. Another thing that went unreported, Lloyd, or very little reporting on it, was the act of the Irish Senate. Techie, can you stick up that picture? The Irish Senate voted to put sanctions on, they've asked the Americans not to send any more weapons via Ireland, and they want to put sanctions against Israel. Now, I don't know how far they'll go or how far they'll get, but again, this has not been widely reported because it doesn't fit in with the Western narrative, does it?
No, it doesn't, and it also doesn't fit with the inherent anti-Irish racism that there is in the British media, and we have to simply straightforwardly accept that. Ireland is too poor, too stupid, and it's somewhere over there, and they do nothing but cause a row in an empty house. That's the overall attitude. What Ireland is doing, like everyone is doing, to some degree is symbolic, but symbols count. Symbols count very much. For every single person under siege in Gaza at the moment, and I know this from visiting Palestine some years ago, the feeling of solidarity, the feeling of the boost to morale that comes from solidarity in other countries is worth its weight in gold to those people. I mean, of course, they need food, they need water, they need a good life. But when under this level of pressure, I know that they feel that support strengthens them, or doesn't necessarily strengthen, but it maintains their resolve, and that is a great thing. The issue here for us, though, is that if Ireland can do this, then I would ask of the Scottish government. You know, there are stories, and they're true. There are unmarked military aircraft and there are marked military aircraft, transport aircraft, traversing the runways of Prestwick Airport in Ayrshire, and it is believed that they are transferring weapons, arms and intelligence to the Israeli government. Now, I would want our government to ask the question of whether or not that is happening, because if we remember correctly, Prestwick Airport is currently owned by the Scottish government. The Scottish government, if it is being used as a transit point for weapons to kill Palestinians, then it is within their gift to prevent those flights flying. And I am surprised that no one in the Scottish Parliament as yet has asked these questions, because I certainly know that a number of members of the Parliament have been asked by people to ask that very question. Going back a bit, if I can, just for a second, to be more positive from what Anis was saying, what you were saying, media has control. But here's an anecdote from last week. My young daughter was at school, a modern studies class. The teacher showed them a piece of BBC footage about the current events in Palestine. And to a person in the class, the kid said, "But that's not what we're seeing on mainstream media. That is a sanitized version of what we all know to be true." And it created a great debate within that modern studies class. And it confirms that we should not be afeard of the future and the future control of the media, because to some degree, the next generation, or certainly my daughter's generation, are taking control of their own newsfeed. and are less led by the nose maybe than some of us of my age, for instance.
Well, yeah, that's exactly why the EU and the British government are looking at ways that they can sanction anything on the internet, because they don't control it, so they want to control us by putting us down. I mean, it's just shocking. I don't know if you saw it, Anna, yesterday. Rachel Reeves was making out the point that people should be getting arrested by the police for being anti-Israel. From that means anyone that says is pro-Palestine or with a Palestine flag, she believes, and she's a future chancellor, by the way, or foreign secretary, that's an end to democracy. I mean, I back the rights of people from Israel to go out and make their demands on the street. That's democracy. I don't agree with them, but I protect their rights and say the right to do it. But it's a bad day if we're being told that we can't support Palestine or Ukraine or whoever if it suits the government.
Well, you see, the thing, I mean, we have to recognize where we are at. And where we are at is a very, very bad position, because we are risking losing everything upon which this so-called, I mean, okay, I'm going to label it, Western civilization was built upon. I mean, the elements of truth, the elements of justice, the elements of equality, the elements of people's rights. I mean, this is fundamental. This doesn't pertain to a particular religion or faith or ideology or political tendency. This is universal. Everyone has human rights, regardless of color, regardless of faith, regardless of creed, regardless of accent. And, you know, these are fundamentals. What we are hearing now, what we are seeing now, and I am in London, I'm at the very heart of everything that's going on, is an absolute erosion of the very fundamentals of those rights and freedoms for which successive governments have claimed that we have gone to war, bombing other nations, killing countless of their innocent civilians, men, children, ill, and the such, and the pretenses for the establishment of democracy, of freedom and human rights. When we are losing them, we are eroding them here at home. This is a moment that everyone needs to recognize. That is why this issue is not something that pertains to the left. It's not something that pertains to the Muslim community. It's not something that pertains to the, you know, the community that heralds from Palestinian origin. This is about every single person who walks the streets of Britain, in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and England. Every single person. And that is what the media is failing in its mission or in its responsibility. We as people who are aware, who hear the news and the such, we have a responsibility to tell it how it is. And regardless of the pressures that come our way, and the pressures are immense, and the challenges are immense. You know, Roddy, in your opening, you mentioned something about, you know, when Scotland comes out to become part of the international community and the such, it'll have to. I'll tell you what's happening in Palestine right now isn't as far away as many people think. In fact, one thing, I mean, we're coming to an election, whether it be within 3 months or 6 months, we're coming on to an election. I asked this question: for any candidate, whether Conservative, whether Labour, whether Lib Dem, anyone, any Conservative who saw what was happening in Gaza, for now, almost 6 months, well, we're coming to 145 days. So we're done with 5 months of a genocide that was labeled a plausible genocide by the ICJ, and yet failed to even call for a ceasefire. No. Some of the parties actually sacked members of their parties because they dared called for a cessation of violence. Imagine that person being in charge of our NHS. Imagine that person being in charge of the future of our children. Imagine that person being in charge with our budget. People who lack humanity regarding others cannot be entrusted with the affairs that concern us directly, with our health sector, with our education sector, with our public sectors. We simply cannot entrust our affairs, our lives, our futures to these people. We're not that far away, by the way.
No, I agree. I think, was it Neil Muller, the German, who said first they came for the communists and I said nothing? Well, you just quite rightly point out, if it's the Palestinians today, it could be the Scots tomorrow. It could be anyone. And that's why we've got to stand up against it. And talking of that, about these people who shouldn't be allowed to make decisions, Lloyd, it's now come out that Chris Bryant, the Labour MP, has admitted that the SNP motion to have an immediate ceasefire was filibustered by the Labour Party under instructions. That, on top of what they did in breaking precedents, is appalling. That these people knew that the actions they were taking was going to prolong a genocide.
Yes, they did. But is this a surprise? Immediately, people enter the precincts of what they term the Palace of Westminster. All normal human behaviour seems to be left at the gate.
Yeah.
That all standards of truth and honour are lost completely, and more importantly, the individuals have lost sight entirely of the fact that they are elected by people to represent those people. They are representatives of the people, and what we witnessed last week was the entire political system in Britain dividing along party lines to the utter and complete exclusion of the electorate. Now, I mean, you know my views on what the Scottish National Party did. I believe what they did was, or could have been, admirable, but they chose the wrong method in which to do it. And as a result of that, Israel won. Israel was the only winner out of the debacle of last week, because we're still talking about the debacle of last week. We're not talking about a cessation of violence. And that was that was the central point of it. And as for the leader of the party of which I am a member, whinging to the world about having been maltreated, well, I think he should spend some time with some history books of how the SNP has been treated in Westminster over the years, how the Irish have been treated, how the Welsh have been treated, and realise you will gain nothing by playing their game. Get the rule book, learn how to bend and break those very rules, and then you will achieve something. But at the moment, the political class can chitter chatter as much as they like about the debacle at Westminster, how this was unfair. What they're failing to say is it was an absolute abandonment of democracy for the sake of party position. And that will always happen in Westminster. I am 66 years old. In my entire lifetime, nothing other than that has been the case.
Yeah. And if I may, Roddy, just, yes. I mean, on the Chris Bryant, I mean, his admission was horrendous. I mean, listen, I mean, I think that what Lloyd has just said is quite important, in that today we don't have politicians. We have masters at cheating. We have people who know how to run a poker table, but we don't have politicians. And that is something that, again, it affects each and every one of us, regardless of whether we know it or not. And it's to our detriment. It's the detriment of our societies, of our countries, of our economies, of our security, of everything. Because these kinds of people, they are absolutely obsessed with short-termism to the effect that they solve no problem whatsoever. Chris Bryant, by the way, used to be, in a previous life, used to be a conservative. And when during his days as a Tory, as a young Tory in Oxford, he used to give out leaflets calling for the hanging of Nelson Mandela. Now, that is the level of, now listen, 1986 is a very long time ago, but we haven't heard a peep out of him since, saying, listen, I was young, I was foolish, I didn't know what I was doing, I didn't write those things, I didn't agree with them. He had the chance to do that over the course of the past, I don't know, what is it now, 40 years? But he hasn't. And that is essential in trying to determine the kind of people, of personalities, of characters, of values that we have sitting in places where they can filibuster in order to prevent a motion that will go far in holding fire and in saving people's lives. When someone stands aside and said, I'm going to stop that, that person needs to be asked far more on where they stand politically, where they stand humanitarianly, where they stand morally. That's the most important question.
It's Lloyd, the United Nations this week also, or last week rather, warned nations that with what was going on in the International Court of Justice, that they should think very carefully before supplying weapons to the US-backed Israeli regime in Tel Aviv. It seems that certainly the UK and Germany, and of course America, are not listening.
No, they're not listening, but they're Security Council members. They are nuclear powers and therefore have the veto. And this is, if anything can come out of this, if we can have an alteration of the structure of the Security Council and the removal of the veto, because this circumstance has shown very clearly that, ultimately the 5 vetoes can prevent humanitarian aid getting directly to the people that need it. And that's what's happened. Now let's be straightforward about this. The application of the veto has caused death. And any country that applies the veto in this circumstance is sanctioning the death of children. That is it. There is no other meaning to what they do. They can dance around saying, but we're still in negotiation as often as they like. The fact is they have the power to stop this. They have chosen not to. And Britain doesn't care about the United Nations. I mean, Britain, for a country of its size and its so-called military might, of course, we know that it's not as mighty as it was. Its contribution to peacekeeping across the world is negligible, utterly and completely negligible, compared with the deployment to train fighting soldiers in various conflict areas in the world, most of which are subject to, to UN resolution. But the Brits carry on with that training. They train the Israelis. They're training them right now. Let's hope for reform of the United Nations. It's the only. In some ways, it's our best hope. But at the same time, for its near 90 years existence, it has given us false hope. Let's hope the smaller countries, let's hope the pressure of the creation of, because you cannot separate G20, G21, BRICS and the United Nations. Ultimately they all become part of the same international system. The BRICS countries really need to start flexing their muscle in a bigger way. And maybe, here's a dream. If Putin says, if Russia says, we will renege on our veto, we will drop our veto, we will be the first to do it. They're not going to do that. I know that. I mean, I am a dreamer. Everyone knows that. But if we could get that, then we get maybe to the place where people believe the United Nations should be. Ordinary people believe the United Nations is a great thing, but then they also see it being entirely ineffective. Here's an opportunity for the United Nations as an overall body to tap into what the population of the world want, which is a United Nations that can step in and prevent disaster, genocide, murder and mayhem across the world. That's what people want, and that's what it should be.
I just want to say, I was just trying to get up there while you were still talking. I just want it to be known that my next blog is called "Should We Get Rid of the Veto at the UN Security Council?" I think you've got my room bugged or something, Lloyd. I had thought of this. It didn't come from here. And I agree with you, as you'll be unsurprised to hear. I absolutely agree with you. I think that's one of the major problems. When you were on here last time, Anis, with the good Professor David Miller, we were talking about the two-state solution, and I was taken back, and I should also add, I learned and I have been educated on calling it Western Asia and not the Middle East. Thank you for that. The two of you said that you didn't agree with a two-state solution. Now, this was before the conflict. I was just wondering, now that we've seen what's happened since October the 7th, have you changed your mind, or has it hardened your views?
Well, I mean, I don't think that my view on this particular issue could be hardened any further than it already is. And listen, one thing that we all know, regardless, I'm not gonna go into a history lesson or an ethical or moral lesson. I will direct everyone's attentions to what is happening every single day in Gaza today. in all seriousness, can anyone look at the scenes of what's happening in Gaza today and say that the perpetrator of the displacement, the perpetrator of the killings, the perpetrator of the shelling of hospitals and schools, the perpetrator of the starvation that 2 million people are suffering today, is that a party that really is ready to establish peace and peaceful coexistence with the very victims that are today displaced, starved, killed, shelled? Is that really, I mean, something that we can accept from a logical, rational point of view? The second thing is, I have never heard an Israeli leader, a political leader, let alone a military leader, speak of two-state solution. In fact, if anything, I have heard time and time and time again political figures in Israel, from Netanyahu, sideways, downwards, whatever, all absolutely rubbish the prospect of a two-state, and for absolutely ridiculous reasons. Sometimes it's, well, we can't establish peace with a party that is governed by Hamas. Sometimes it's about the Palestinian resistance. It's sometimes about, it's all ridiculous. It's all rubbish. Two-state solution is in order to buy time, so that more land can be grabbed, so that more settlements can be built, so that more people can be shipped from various corners around the world onto this piece of land. And to hopefully, within that time that everyone is waiting for something called the two-state solution, more and more treacherous Arab regimes can jump on that ship called normalization and the Abrahamic Accord and whatever, and so that then it becomes almost impossible. The fact is that it's an impossible scenario that is being discussed by a party that will never ever have it, and another party who is absolutely being held against the barrel of a gun. That is not a negotiation position. I'm a hostage negotiator. I know what a negotiation looks like. This is not a negotiation. So to think that there is any kind of, and by the way, even our politicians who often talk about a two-state solution, they talk about a safe, secure, independent, sovereign Israel and a viable Palestinian state. There is no equity. There is no equity. And therefore, it's a non-runner. It's just to waste time and to buy time. Let's get rid of all this pretense. Palestine, for hundreds of years, used to be one of the most fantastic lands in the entire globe, where Jews, Christians, Muslims, people of all faiths lived together side by side, worshipped, lived, traded, married, and it was fantastic until the Zionist project came and grabbed it. And we have what we have now, almost a century onwards. This needs to come to an end.
Yeah. You know, I put out a tweet not so long ago, a couple of months back. Lloyd, as you can see by my name, MacLeod, we come from two Norwegian princes, Normand and Torquil. So I put out a funny tweet saying, you know, I think all MacLeods should meet up with me and we'll go to Norway and we'll all take it over because our ancient homeland is Norway, let's have it. I mean, you guys are laughing just now, but that's exactly what we're getting told in the Middle East.
Very true.
You know, and some guy in the sky told them they could go and take it back. It is as ridiculous as my statement about Norway. They justify this mass murdering, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the theft of land, the ignoring of UN resolutions. It is ridiculous.
Absolutely ridiculous. It's allowed to happen. You know, they claim to be the people of the book, but they only choose to use particularly convenient chapters and lines from the book. It's interesting. I fell for the two-state solution concept for a very long time, and I rejected it a long time ago as well, because I looked from the shores of Scotland across to the 6 counties of the north of Ireland, and I saw what partition does. It creates conflict. Yeah. Now, what's happening in with the false creation of the occupier state in Israel and the Palestinian people has been conflict. Any division on a two-state solution will maintain that conflict. But let's be honest about the Israeli position. On Wednesday of last week, a motion was passed by a huge majority in the Knesset rejecting entirely the concept of a Palestinian state. Yeah. That happened. And that happened the day before our debacle in the House of Commons. And no one seems to have paid much attention to that in the House of Commons, what had been decided in the Knesset in the previous day. And if they had, maybe matters would have been different. But there are many ways round the issue of the one-state solution. I remember being at a conference in northern Romania with the Hungarian minority there, who were deeply frightened about Romania coming out of the Warsaw Pact, becoming an independent country, and how they would be dominated by the majority Romanians. And a suggestion that they came up with was an interesting one, which was for autonomy based on two codes. A code of law for Romanians and a code of law for Hungarians. It's an interesting concept. And then I looked into that. And this was a proposal that was made, I think, by Lord Caradon, Michael Foot's brother, who was the British ambassador to the United Nations in the early 70s. That there was it was a theoretical paper. It wasn't a clear position, but his theoretical paper went along the lines of the only way this will operate is if you have a single state solution, but those, if it is, and this was back in the early 70s. So if you divide on religious lines, then there could be a political and legal codes for the Muslim population, the Christian population, and the Jewish population. And I thought that's an interesting concept, but that completely falls down when you recognize that that would not bring the unity that any country needs to have. The healing between the Israeli occupier and the Palestinian will take time, will not be easy. But look at South Africa. Look at South Africa as a model. Now, the South Africans themselves have said that what they have witnessed in Palestine is much, much worse than they suffered. And they are correct in saying that. That might be news to some good people in Western civilization, but it is true. And if they have been able to achieve what they have achieved within such a short period of time, good people with the right intent could bring the one-state solution to reality. But it takes will. It takes political will. And so long as you have the settler concept directly and centrally part of the Israeli government and the Israeli polity, then that's not going to happen. There is a need for new leaders, and to some degree, on the Palestinian side as well, a broader vision. We need a broader vision. It was only last week that it became clear that the PFLP, the DFLP, and many other organizations are actually very much part of this resistance. This is not Hamas as one. Now, I've said this before. There is a political prisoner that the Israelis have been holding for at least 20 years now, called Marwan Barghouti. He, in some ways, is, we make these terrible comparisons. He is not the Nelson Mandela of Palestine. He is he's a Palestinian. If Marwan Barghouti was allowed out of prison, would that be a step towards the development of a true dialogue? I would wish for something like that to happen, to take us down the road towards the reconciliation that would be required to create what is the only viable solution, which is a one state, and that state should be Palestine.
Very interesting, if I may, Roddy. The example that you cited, Lloyd, regarding South Africa. Very, very interesting, because it's the most recent and experience that we all were part of. We saw, and we met the people that were elements of that particular change and that particular struggle. Now, people give the example of Nelson Mandela and how he basically embraced the white South Africans and the such. And I always tell people, yes, because Nelson Mandela accepted and agreed to leave Robben Island prison and to become part of the process which then made him president, because the apartheid system had come down crumbling, had failed. It was the end of. It was finished. There wasn't an apartheid system with which he was negotiating. He insisted that that system needed to come to an end, that everyone, even those who are part and elements of the apartheid system, needed to recognize that was the end of that, in order then to create the new South Africa. We can't have, in Palestine, we can't have a peace. We can't have even Marwan Barghouthi, whom I absolutely agree with you on. We can't have anyone coming out and saying, I'm going to negotiate with a state which believes absolutely in an ideology that perpetrates the taking and the grabbing of other people's lands, the belief that other people do not have a place in this thing that they call Israel, and that other people of other faiths do not have the same rights as a Jewish person who has probably never ever in their lives entered or traveled to Israel, yet living in Peru or Chile or Argentina or the such. With that, you can't have any kind of semblance of peace. And therefore, it's incredibly important to recognize. And one last thing that I'll leave you with. What is wrong with the passage of time doesn't become right. I mean, yes, we do have facts on the ground. Yes. But we mustn't leave our senses in that, well, we are here. That's something a politician, a failed politician, a limited-minded politician would say, well, we're here today, so let's deal with what we have. I'm sorry, but we are human beings who, to us, to everyone, justice is elemental. And therefore, what is wrong must be recognized as being wrong. It does not become right with the passage of time.
I'm sorry, there's a phone going in the background and the person's left the room. I apologise for that. Lloyd, one of the things about apartheid being defeated in South Africa was that the world reviled against it. The South Africans were excluded from international sport. They were in trade, and it was only by sanction busting by the British, the biggest sanction busters, that eventually brought down the apartheid regime in South Africa. If the European Union, the United States of America, and their poodle, the United Kingdom, refuse to acknowledge that the apartheid state of Israel exists and that there is a genocide, what chance have we got of getting to this one state?
I think we've got a limited ability to get to that to get to that position. I agree with everything that Anas just said. We are South Africa is not comparable in real terms at this present time, and we all want a solution, but all of the solutions are going to take time. They're going to take quite a lot of time. We can't expect everything to be done tomorrow, which is what happens in, when you play British party politics. What we're looking for here is we're looking for the Israelis to start admitting to themselves truths which the white South Africans admitted to themselves. And I can't see that happening at the moment. And I cannot also see it being imposed from the outside. What I can see is if a sanctions regime, a true and proper sanctions regime, was applied to Israel, then the chokehold that would require them to come to the sensible negotiating table would happen much more rapidly than it happened in South Africa, because South Africa had huge natural resources. Israel has no natural resources. And what little natural resource they have, they're stealing from the Palestinians, including the gas and oil off the coast of Gaza and all the water. I find that I can't say anything more. I'm actually still trying to process some of the things that Anas said, which has put real questions in my mind as to where we go next. And this is such a difficult situation, but such a moving situation, that every piece of new information you get leads you going back through the files in your mind to see where we go forward. I am firmly now behind the idea of the one-state solution, because I cannot possibly see how two states without conflict could coexist in any way whatsoever. And I just hope that there's an outbreak of humanity. I'm sorry if that was somewhat incoherent, but that's where I am now.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
What's always confused me, Anis, is this: the other Arab nations, particularly the Gulf states, the Arab, with the power they've got, the Arab states, with the amount of oil and what they could, the stranglehold they could put on the West to force the West to take action against Israel and to try and bring to this one-state solution. But they don't. Wouldn't that be the first step for the Arab world to come together?
You'd think so. Unfortunately, we have Arab states, and I exclude no one, Arab states that are absolutely 100% at the behest of their sponsors. And their sponsors happen to be the military powers, particularly the United States. You know that America has more than 60 mega bases, military bases throughout the Middle East. And those bases aren't there, for the, for the convenience of anyone in particular. They are there in order to rule and to govern and to influence. You can't imagine a country, let's just mention one, Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. You can't imagine them with about 4 or 5 mega military bases housing something up to 20 to 25,000 military personnel, with incredible hangars full of ammunition and arsenal of weapons and the like, to actually do anything that displeases the United States. I mean, it's almost unthinkable. It's sad, but one of the aspects, we're talking about countries that produce nothing, Roddy. You talk about the riches; those are mineral riches that just appeared from underneath their, people's feet. They're not anything that people contributed towards. We're not talking about immense agricultural projects. We're not talking about something, industries that people actually built. We're talking about something that just happened coincidentally. It's a coincidence of geography, nothing more. So you're talking about a people that are reliant on the likes of the United States, the likes of Europe, for every single thing, from a needle to their cars and their homes and their such. You can't imagine that these kind of countries, these kinds of regimes would even consider, even have the fleeting thought of doing something or saying something that would, that would displease the providers of the essential elements of their everyday life. It's just absolutely impossible. It takes, when in 2011, and I'm a firm believer in this, when in 2011, when there was the advent of what we coined today the Arab Spring in Egypt and Tunisia, we saw what the peoples of those countries are capable of doing. We saw the amount of frustration, indignation that is kept within those nations and those people. And then we saw, within a matter of less than 2 years, we saw the absolute brutal response from the military coups to dictators, paper mache dictators, but the kind of brutality, ruthlessness that they treated their own people, almost telling them that this is your lesson for ever thinking that you deserve freedom, that you deserve a free vote at the ballot box, that you deserve to choose. It was and that counter-revolution was absolutely fully supported by the United States, by ourselves, by Europe, by the major powers who could have actually looked after those fledgling democracies. But we watched on as the tanks crushed innocent people who were just basically looking for their own freedom. And by the way, and just so that people connect things one to another, after Mubarak in Egypt, after he stood down in early February of 2011, a mere 3 days later, there was another incident that at the time I watched second by second for a matter of 3 hours on Al Jazeera, that about 3,000 to 4,000 Egyptian revolutionaries, they moved from the Tahrir Square all the way to the square where the building that housed the Israeli embassy in Cairo was. And this was nighttime. And one of those revolutionaries scaled the building, about 8 floors, scaled the building physically as the cameras followed him. And he went up to the top of the tower, brought down the Israeli flag, and put up a Palestinian flag. That was in Egypt. The only thing that unifies those 300 million Arabs, the only thing that unifies them is Palestine. The thing that divides them and continues to keep them under the thumb are the regimes. So to hope that the regimes will one day wake up and realize what their real national interests are is too dreamy, too wishy-washy in my book.
Could it be, Lloyd, that, I mean, already the global BRICS has a higher GDP than the G7? The power is switching. There is no doubt we're having multipolarities coming in. The countries all over the world are de-dollarizing. Could a rising BRICS and a strengthening BRICS, could they apply pressure and make America and the EU, for example, to change their minds?
I would certainly hope so, Roddy, but I think the problem always comes here with I think it was von Clausewitz who said, war is politics by other means, and war and politics are inextricably linked with control of the global economy. I think BRICS is seen by the Western countries particularly as a challenge to their hegemony, particularly the UK, the European Union and the United States. And as such, I fear that conflict would be the result, because we're being wound up towards the conflict, towards the two, not the most important, but two of the important countries in BRICS, namely Russia and China. Now, these are the current enemies. We're being wound up to believe that it's the time to go and take on the Chinese, which is just utter and complete stupidity. I would hope that the BRICS countries, and I think it's interesting, South Africa's involvement, South Africa being a very important part of the BRICS structure, that it was they that went to the ICJ with the case against Israel. Mm. Will there be benefit in the long run from BRICS for the poor of the world? I would hope so, but history tells us that not necessarily. Economic blocs look after themselves. One of my areas of interest is the Hanseatic League, which was the Middle Ages version of the European Union, and ultimately it ended up creating more war and more poverty after a period of creating peace and prosperity. So, I think we all have to be careful that history will repeat itself. But BRICS has to make use of its pressure. It has to.
As we're coming towards the end of our time, do you see anything coming out of the ICJ that would give you any hope that we could get at least a ceasefire and end the killing?
Well, very quickly, in answer to your question, yes, I hope so. But I think that there's something probably and arguably more important than any of that. Any of the provisional measures, fine. The outcome that might take years to arrive at, okay, fine. Let's hope for the best there. But by the way, there is something far more important that we have gained as pro-Palestinian activists. As a result of this, firstly, no one has the legal right anymore to accuse me, you, Lloyd, anyone else of being anti-Semitic when we criticize the policies of Israel. No one can, because the ICJ has now said that plausibly, the Israeli government has been complicit in genocide. Okay, so that in its own, the fact now, as someone whom since I was a kid, I was always, onto the case of Palestine, always. Palestine was always playing in our, Palestinian songs, Palestinian poetry, Palestinian emblems. It was always fake. And I'm not from Palestinian heritage, by the way. I'm from Iraqi heritage. But nonetheless, the fact that a team of legal experts stood before the world and for 8 continuous hours outlined point by magnificent point the case against Israel and the case for Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians without it being interrupted was magnificent, unprecedented. It is there. It is in the echelons of history. It is in the catalogue of what has happened forever. No one can take that away. No, this wasn't a news report. It wasn't a nice documentary done by dispatches on Channel 4. This was a case brought before the ICJ for hour upon hour, case upon case outlined against Israel. That in itself is unprecedented. You know what? I don't even care what the outcome will be in 2030 or whenever that comes out. I care about what we can do with this. We can do TV dramas. We can do films. We can write novels. We can write poetry. We can draw images from that case alone. And it's a legal case and no one can accuse it of being anti-Semitic. I think we've won. I think we've won. And regardless of what the ICJ decides at the end.
That's very, very optimistic. Are you as optimistic, Lloyd?
Yes. I am optimistic, but you have to be reminded, and what Anas just said reminded me that, what keeps us going, keeps us ticking over. I mean, and this is a fight I've been part of for a long time. You have to look for the positives, and what Anas just said is absolutely correct. 20 years ago, when I came back from Jenin in 2002, this wasn't on the table. We didn't have this. The complete change in the mindset. I mean, what I said earlier about the debate in the modern studies class in my daughter's school, that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago because they didn't have the social media, and they now through social media have had access to those 8 hours of testimony in the ICJ, and that's available to everyone. It's Israel's worst nightmare. The cat's out the bag, the genie's out the bottle. It's all over in real terms, and we have to keep reminding ourselves. When you see the pictures, particularly of the children, and for me the older people, that's partly personal circumstance, it's heartbreaking, and all you can see is the dark side. We have to, it's what keeps you going in any political campaign. You have to draw the best from it. And what Anas just outlined is a reminder to us all. What has been achieved at terrible cost is a great step forward. It really is. So yes, I'm optimistic. I am optimistic.
And we must never stop talking about Palestine, Anas, must we?
Absolutely not. And God rest his soul, John Pilger, the man that said, Palestine is still the story. And indeed, in the absence of great people like him, we talked about the media and its problems. We talked about the state of speaking truth to power. And, giants like John Pilger were determinants in the whole struggle. Their time might have been, as Lloyd said, very difficult to even mention Israel in bad breath. But it is because of efforts of people like himself, many people around the world like himself, that we are here today, that the South Africans have managed to bring their case before the entire world. So yeah, absolutely, we'll never stop talking. It's a matter of justice and injustice that affects each and every one of us. We mustn't stop talking about it.
No, we must not. And there we come to an end. Gentlemen, thank you. Techie, before we go, I want to fade out. I've purposely not put too many pictures or any pictures up that could. But I think we need to remember, there's a picture now going to come up of a 17-year-old boy and a young lad in Palestine dying of starvation because of what the Israelis are doing. I want you to keep this picture in your mind, folks, and never stop talking about Palestine. Stick it up, take it. 17 years of age. Does that look like a terrorist to you? Never forget, ladies and gentlemen. And until we see you again, please, take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.